conference?
We came up too soon.
No, we didn't. We came out at the right time. Let's do it. That was a fantastic fade. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Let's do it. As people walk in.
Welcome to day 2, everybody. Confluence, yes. I hope we're not as cold today or as hot. We're going to try to find a nice middle ground with an incredible stack of presenters and workshops and tech playground. Did you want to?
Yeah. So before you go into the housekeeping things, in reflection, yesterday's energy was really, really organic, quaint, curious, and today I feel like you could almost consider that as a primer for us to go towards more of a pragmatic or hands-on approach of what we discussed yesterday with some of the conversations as well as the workshops later on. And that's really thinking about the conceptual framing of these technological accelerants and how they can actually, now you look back at things you engage in and how would you integrate them or how would you make them your own in the processes in which you work in. I have a lot of analogies. It's too early for analogies. I'll come in hot. Did somebody say no? No. But in short, in terms of that hands-on experience, there are things here, and then we also have the tech playground that a lot of people have put a lot of thought and labor into as well, like Mr. Campion, who's still hanging out there. And back there we have the Switchboard's VR videos, and there's an example from the Seattle one back there, and there's a few other ones in the video game that's over there in Juniper City. There's a motion capture. Is it capture or caption? I forget. A motion capture demonstration as well.
Put me down in front of the group.
And then there's the digital zine, which is a hyperlinked.
Yeah, that's cool.
It's a hyperlink magazine to resources. And there's AI tools for real-time language interpretation. Our friends at UNHCR's USA Hive have a booth there. They're wonderful to collaborate with. There is the SMS messaging with
Chris.
Where's Chris? Right here. Yeah. There's that. And then the AI career coaching and smart tools for career readiness. So get in there, get messy, take away as much as you can from the second day.
Yeah, and the second day is very much more hands-on, but we're still coming back to our core objectives of this conference, that we are looking at different opportunities to scale the program we have and looking at different models of doing that or improving or growing models and scaling remotely with limited resources, improving connectivity, which will be our panel today, which I'm very excited about. How do you share timely, accurate information in new ways that actually connect clients to those resources in ways that they understand and can find and that are accessible? Everything through a safety and ethical lens, which yesterday was a big part of our keynote presentation and our panel on sustainable AI. And then how to design in partnerships. Folks have called it co-generation, co-creation. It's all the same, that we don't make something for somebody, we do it together as a group. That synergy is also the synergy of this event. So still keep showing up with your curiosity, with your interests, with your expertise. You are also part of the program. And so thank you for coming this morning ready to be engaged. And with that, here is our incredible stack of today's agenda. We will start with an incredible keynote, and I'll read his bio in just a minute. Very excited about that, Hisham. We'll have a little break to go hit up that snack bar over there. And then we will have a panel about reaching hard-to-reach clients and information sharing with some key experts that are local and from different parts of the United States. Our tech playground will be open during lunch and then close. So if you have not hit up any of that incredible list, today is your day, 12 to 1. And then we will get to dive into hands-on workshops. And so these are the three. So be thinking, where do I fit as the day's coming to an end and we're landing our plane? using tech for everyday challenges, when we have tech demos on automation, on customized GPTs, kind of getting into that AI space? Or do I want to make multilingual learning videos and different tools in which you can do that, and some of our partners with Nearlife and Synthesia? Or if you are a state refugee coordinator, you will be going to that third one. I'm sorry. It's going to be amazing, but you must go. It is going to be amazing. And then we will close our room with just thoughts from you. And with that, let me introduce our incredible keynote for day 2. Hisham Zawil is a global lead for technology and digital partnerships at UNHCR. He is also part of the UN Refugee Agency, where he drives the agency's digital engagement strategy and builds collaborations with tech sector to advance AI and digital solutions for displaced communities. With a career spanning international development, refugee resettlement, and tech partnerships, Hisham has worked with leading tech companies, UN agencies to design innovative programs addressing global challenges. Previously, he led U.S. private sector partnerships for the World Food Program and spent 6 years at the International Rescue Committee. Some people in the room were his supervisor, way back in the day, and managing the agency's refugee resettlement services in San Francisco Bay Area before working at HQ and advancing global tech initiatives. Hisham also advises tech for good startups like Tarjimly and Alturu on product and partnership strategy. Let's give a warm welcome to Hisham.
Thank you, Christy, for that warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to see a lot of old friends as well as make some new friends. I feel like I'm with family when I'm engaging with IRC in these spaces. First, I want to give a huge thank you to Christy, to Sarah, to Milad, to all the other organizers that I didn't mention for putting together this amazing event. So really another round of applause. It's been a fantastic time so far. I think we need to.
Is it 2 screens or no?
Maybe I need to X this up.
Slides are very beautiful and technical.
They're just a little bit gimmicky, but par for the course. All right. So the conversation today is really going to be beyond technology. How do we approach solving problems and avoid the pitfall of technosolutionism, the hype around AI, but also how do we approach technology with a socio-technical lens? There's a lot of themes that we'll be talking about today that were mentioned yesterday, so I think there's a really nice through line in our conversation. So as Christy mentioned, I work with the UN Refugee Agency. Part of our job is to not only build solutions, but also to advise technology companies on how they might create policies that respect the principles of protection, peace, and safety for displaced communities, civilians in armed conflict, and other vulnerable communities. So I wanted to start with a conversation that for me crystallized the very challenges that we face today. Not long ago, I was meeting with members of our UNHCR protection and cash aid team from one of our regional offices. On the other side of the table was a senior executive of a major fintech unicorn. This is a huge company. They were going public soon, and we're really excited about this conversation. We were discussing a critical issue. How do we help refugees protect their modest savings from hyperinflation and also use digital wallets and stable coin currencies to protect from vital and volatile currency fluctuations? Our team, drawing on years of on-the-ground experience, began to lay the real-world challenges that refugees face. Note that this team is outside-the-box thinkers, they're innovators, they're really like one of the right teams that you want to engage with at a field level. So they spoke of refugees who lack official documentation to open bank accounts. They described the inconsistent internet connectivity because places where refugees are settled are oftentimes not priorities for connectivity infrastructure, and oftentimes due to documentation challenges, they're not able to get SIM cards. So they detailed the long-term policy and protection advocacy required to negotiate with host governments for inclusion. The necessity, and I don't think this is going to be news for all of us, to provide wraparound services, case management, business and entrepreneurship training, protection assessments, anytime you want to work with refugee communities. This is the trusted human guidance that's important to enable digital inclusion. After listening patiently, the executive then reframed the entire conversation to us. So, they said, what you're really facing here is a user adoption challenge. Have you considered making the app more responsive? Maybe we can work with you to integrate an LLM chatbot to improve the user journey. We can get some engineers to work on this ASAP. We have some user design experts that can get started tomorrow. In that moment, the disconnect was clear. The complex, layered human problems of legal status, socioeconomic exclusion, and trust were flattened into a simple technical problem: user interface design. The real problem: how do we build an inclusive financial ecosystem for the most vulnerable, was set aside. So this reminds me of an ad that I saw for a Gen AI product that we all know about, but I've been told that I can't mention any companies. And we don't endorse any products. So a young man is making pasta sauce. He makes a mistake and spills sugar instead of salt into the bowl. He opens up his AI assistant and scans the table, and as luck might have it, he has flour, butter, and vanilla ready to go. The AI suggests, in a very cool, technical way, he could change the sauce into cookies. He follows the instructions enthusiastically and has a lovely snack. So this is a perfect, almost comically trivial example of a phenomenon called problem orphaning. The man started off with a problem. I'm hungry, I want to make dinner. Help me make dinner. And the AI offered a solution, not to his original problem, but to an adjacent one that it was better equipped to handle. What can I make with these ingredients? His original problem, his need to make food, was orphaned. He learned nothing about cooking dinner. He got a snack instead of a meal. And what was presented as an innovation was in fact a derailment. So this is a comical example, trivial almost, it's in an ad. But what happens when the orphan problem is much more consequential? What happens when it's a family's asylum application? A choice of who gets to stay in the country, a choice of the golden ticket of resettlement for a person in a country of second asylum. What happens when the derailed solution isn't cookies, but a caseworker who's diluted his or her assessment rigor regarding housing, employment, and the extension of rental assistance? And I think this is the question that brings me here today. The immense promise of technology to aid in refugee resettlement, to support humanitarian work, is shadowed by a new kind of risk, one born not of malice, but of misguided solutionism. Before I go on, I also wanted to recognize that technology and innovation does play a huge role in the work that we do. We've heard a lot of amazing projects yesterday, and we're going to continue to hear some today. But I wanted to take us beyond the code, beyond the promise of an AI-driven future, to explore a more human and effective way to serve refugees. So a little bit of our journey today. First, I'm going to start with the problem, framing it a little bit, deep diving into Technosolutionism. What are some of the drivers? Why is it that we talk about solving problems with technology today? also talk a little bit about kind of the AI hype cycle. Second, we'll talk about some critical lenses that we've also mentioned yesterday, like socio-technical approaches to evaluation and some of the different pieces there, as well as some of the vital perspectives from the global south. These are ultimately the communities that we're working with. And then finally, we'll briefly talk about some of the frameworks and guidelines that I found to be really useful in terms of solving these problems. So part one, the problem. At the heart of our challenge is a worldview that reduces the complexity of human experiences and the challenges that we face, shaped by socioeconomic and political realities, into a problem that can be engineered away. It sees poverty, displacement, injustice, and disease not as deeply rooted socioeconomic issues, but as technical glitches awaiting a solution. If only we had more data, more compute power, more data centers, and more advanced artificial intelligence. So the allure is undeniable. It's a really fantastic story. The world has overwhelming needs and limited resources. The promise of systems that can operate with great speed, with great efficiency, is powerful. We're told that AI can optimize aid distribution, can help us with resettlement placements, predict displacement flows, streamline case management, predict self-sufficiency rates, etc. These are efficiencies that humans could never match. And I think this narrative of effectiveness is central. It proposes that the tangled realities of displacement, of trauma, of injustice can be untangled and resolved with enough data, with enough processing power. In these views, societal problems become engineering projects, and human suffering becomes a data set to be optimized. You can see that I've been in the Bay Area for quite too long. So why is this bad? I'll argue that this is bad for two reasons. First, reflects on the effect of the technology itself, and the second is on our framing of problems and challenges and how this might be a distraction. I think first, technosolutionism really takes us away from what makes humanitarians or folks that work in the social impact space impactful, our most essential currency, which is empathy. It reframes the complex, deeply human struggles into engineering tasks to be broken down, quantified, and solved through algorithms. When we view a refugee not as a person with a history, a worldview, unique set of experiences, but as a collection of data points to be processed, we begin to commit what I call the error of dispassion. I found this to be a really interesting concept. The error of dispassion isn't an act of malice or hatred. It's the harm born from approaching work with the absence of feeling, from a cold systematic logic that proceeds without moral and ethical reflection. For example, an algorithm can deny somebody housing, and I think somebody yesterday mentioned algorithmic redlining when you're looking at mortgages and mortgage assessments. It doesn't hate that family. It simply executes the function. A chatbot that provides inaccurate legal assistance to an asylum seeker isn't being cruel. It's a machine that can't understand the nuances of trauma, of culture, and of law. Such a machine operates on the logic of optimization and efficiency. But that logic sits in irresolvable tension with the demands of moral reasoning and empathy, which is slow and reflective. This process creates a moral and dispassionate vacuum, where a system's complexity can be used as a screen to obscure the deliberate choices that lead to questionable outcomes. And I think this is the seductive pull that we talked about when we think about technological objectivity. We're told that with data, dashboards, and AI, we can make better, fairer decisions because they're free from human emotions, like prejudice, bias, and anger. Yet, I think this view misunderstands what makes human judgment valuable, especially when you're talking about the messy relationship between perhaps a humanitarian and the people that they're serving. It really affects our capacity for compassionate and ethical deliberation, our ability to weigh the unquantifiable, our instinct to show empathy, and to make informed decisions. I don't think that empathy are bugs to be engineered out of the system. I think these are the very features that make our work humane and more impactful. But you might argue we can engineer cultural sensitivity and empathy into our AI. We can make an AI that's more culturally sensitive, an AI that perhaps loves. I think this myth is a fiction. More often than not, the attempt to systematize compassion leads to the complete opposite, especially when our staff are interacting with these tools. When we apply this logic, we create systems where we might become cogs in a machine, participating in actions whose effects are beyond our moral ability to reason and make decisions. So there's another really interesting framework relating to how technology affects us as professionals and as practitioners. It's by a psychologist called Herbert Kelman. And he details 3 different processes that weaken our ethical and humanitarian judgments when it comes to using technology. So I know Milad mentioned that we wanted to have a very practical discussion, so go into a little bit more theory. We'll get to the practical. So I don't think these are just abstract concepts. These are things that play out anytime we use technology or perhaps even rely on technology. So the first is authorization. This is the process whereby we feel permitted to act in certain ways that we wouldn't otherwise behave because a legitimate authority sanctions it. In our context, an AI system becomes that authority. Imagine an overworked caseworker. I know, very hard to imagine. They're faced with a family application for emergency financial assistance. But the agency just rolled out a new tool that generates a benefit eligibility score. The system flags this family as low priority based on a set of analysis. Maybe they looked at missed appointments, maybe they reviewed their ESL class attendance, but this tool doesn't know that the family had a sudden illness. The case manager, seeing the definite data-driven score from a system that their supervisors endorsed, feels authorized to follow its recommendation and not give them the aid. So the responsibility for this decision shifts from their own shoulders onto the objective logic of the machine. Their own human intuition, which might have told them to dig into this a little bit more, to listen to the pleas of a distraught mother, just asking for one more check, is overridden by the system's authority. The next is routinization. This is the fragmentation of complex work into a series of repetitive tasks. This makes it easier for us to follow the procedural details rather than the meaning of our work. Another example, think of an education coordinator tasked with enrolling dozens of children into the local school district. But they get a new data-driven and AI-powered platform. This platform uses NLP, natural language processing, to scan documents. It looks at transcripts of intake, interviews, and uses biometrics to help understand where refugee children should be placed. So the job of the educational coordinator isn't about sitting with the family, understanding the child's unique needs, the psychosocial needs of this family, identifying potential learning disabilities. It instead becomes a series of data entry tasks, uploading documents, checking boxes, and moving the digital profile from pending to enrolled. The focus shifts to efficiency, to meeting a daily quota. In this routinized workflow, a crucial detail in a child's file, for example, a note about trauma, the experience of violence, a history of interrupted schooling, which we know refugees face, can be missed. This system is designed for a standardized child. It provides little opportunity to recognize, let alone address the needs for children that don't follow a specific mold. And we know that immigrant and refugee children oftentimes don't. Finally, the most consequential is a process that culminates in dehumanization. This affects both the client as well as the caseworker. First, the refugee is no longer a person with agency, but rather an object to be processed. Their life, their story, their skills, their hopes are decomposed into data sets and reaggregated into patterns. And then they're classified into high risk, job ready, non-compliant. Their unique identity and story is lost and then flattened into a profile. Again, this idea of flattening. But I think the caseworker is also affected. They're stripped of their moral agency, of that decision-making rigor that is unquantifiable, that drive that helps them make decisions in the messy interaction when it comes to doing humanitarian work or doing social impact work. They're no longer using the skills they were trained for, building rapport, listening with compassion, making nuanced, holistic assessments. They're managing an interface, and I think this erodes their sense of purpose and transforms them from a person who needs to work with care to a person that's an administrator. I think when we design and employ technologies that treat human beings as object and as suffering as a technical problem, I think we're committing that error of dispassion. We're building systems that, in the pursuit of effectiveness, ignore the cultural, emotional, and linguistic depth that makes us human. This might not sound like a huge problem today, but if we hear different voices that talk about having more efficiency when it comes to immigration or decisions in government, building even more databases and compiling even more data about our communities, that's where the risk is. I'll deep dive into problem orphaning a little bit more beyond the pasta sauce question. When we approach the world through the narrow lens of what AI and technology can solve, we inevitably reshape problems to fit available solutions, leaving the real complex challenges untouched and unaddressed. We see this writ large in the humanitarian sector. Technology is often applied without a deep, nuanced understanding of the full social, political, and economic roots of refugee challenges. We might implement a solution for a symptom, but not addressing the underlying disease. For example, a predictive model meant to identify the most at-risk individuals for refugee resettlement based on available data. But what does that data capture? It likely captures who has access to registration systems, who speaks a language that system understands, people and families that fit a preconceived notion of vulnerability. The model doesn't solve the problem of who in fact is the most vulnerable. It solves the problem that it's better engineered to identify. Who is the most visible to the data? The true problem, how do we reach the invisible, often most marginalized, the people that sit outside of our data gathering apparatus, is orphaned. And I think this goes back to that magic bullet idea. It's the seductive idea that a powerful enough algorithm can cut through the messy realities of politics and conflict to deliver a clean and effective solution. In reality, the overwhelming narratives of AI mask deeper systemic inequalities, allowing institutions to avoid the difficult long-term work of structural policy change. For example, why do we need an AI to manage resource scarcity in a refugee camp, or to get computer vision to help us pinpoint settlement locations and map services. What is the problem we're trying to solve here? Is the problem the lack of sophisticated algorithms, or is it that fundamentally there isn't enough resources to go around because of inadequate funding and political indifference? So an AI solution, while appearing proactive and innovative, directs our attention away from the political and policy failures at the root of certain problems. It allows us to do something while avoiding the much harder task of advocating for solutions and for a global system that provides genuine safety, peace, and dignity to refugee communities. And sometimes the deployment of these technologies have the effect of reinforcing the same inequalities that they're designed to address. For example, a biometric ID system that is designed for digital inclusion becomes a barrier for those, for cultural reasons, personal reasons, are unable or unwilling to enroll. The technology doesn't fail to solve the problem, it creates additional layers of exclusion. So there's a few different examples, and these examples continue to be highlighted in the news. So there was a Dutch child care benefit scandal, where an algorithm designed to detect fraud disproportionately targeted families with dual nationalities, plunging thousands into debt based on biased data. The system solved the narrow technical problem of identifying statistical risk factors, but it orphaned the real human problem. How do we ensure that families receive the support they need to thrive? Similarly, in Pennsylvania, there was a predictive model for child abuse risk, and it was found to be biased against low-income families, who, by nature of their interaction with public services, were more heavily surveilled and therefore generated more data. Low-income families are going to the Social Security office, they're going to the Health and Human Services, and so therefore the model that's being developed is biased to that data because there was more data about these communities. And it was found that poor and African American families were heavily affected by this work. So the system targeted the data, not the danger and risk of abuse. I think this leads to the final dynamic. This is the hype cycle, and who is capturing the AI narrative. The discourse around AI isn't neutral. It's not a neutral reflection of technological progress. It's a carefully constructed story, shaped primarily by commercial actors who have the most to gain from telling this. There's a fantastic research that was just released by the AI Now Institute that powerfully argues this point. AI development and frontier models are often driven by a few large tech firms. And then you hear the bigger is better paradigm. We need to invest $50 billion in building more data centers across the United States. But this aligns with business models. This doesn't align with how we might solve problems in the world. There's also a strong narrative of inevitability, a future where AI is not just a tool, but a force in every aspect of our lives, from healthcare to government to education to art. How do we write scripts? This narrative is propped up by very high valuations and massive investments. But even when business models continue to be shaky. So a lot of companies, especially the big AI companies, they're investing a lot of money. They get a lot of foreign investment. They have very high valuations, so they're able to get a lot of venture capital funding. But they always report sky-high losses every single year in the multiple billions. And so there's this pull to continue to drive this narrative that just a few more billions and we'll get to this magic bullet. We just need to build a few more data centers and then we're going to build an AI that's going to solve cancer. And I think that's a huge risk. There are also some forcing functions that enable this growth. First, we see a lot of investment in AI for defense and national security. There's geopolitical competition for technological superiority. So you hear this a lot. We need to build much better AI so that China doesn't outbuild it for us. And so that is a huge driver. And then, of course, there's the general competition and market dominance across a few of the companies. So I laid out some of the dynamics and some of the drivers for this narrative that we see. But how do we begin to design technology that avoids this pitfall? So first, it starts with applying the right analytical frameworks, lenses that help us see the gaps and asymmetries that are often invisible in the actual technology itself. And this is something that was mentioned, I think, yesterday when we talk about sociotechnical approaches to technology. First, we must recognize that technology is never just technical, especially AI. Evaluating an AI system based on just its technical components, the algorithms, the data sets, its processing speed, its output is insufficient. So this is where we bring about the socio-technical approaches to both risk assessment, but also how do we develop this work. So the impact of a technology is an emergent property of the interaction of the technology with people and the system. So the context is really what determines whether a capability causes harm and is impactful. A perfectly designed algorithm can cause immense harm if it's deployed in a flawed institutional concept. So to understand this, there's 3 different layers, and then I'll provide some examples within each of these layers. So there's first the capability layer. This is the technical core. This is looking at evaluating the model itself in isolation. For example, can the AI-powered translation tool correctly render specific refugee dialects in the language of an asylum officer? Does the training data for a predictive model contain harmful stereotypes? These are questions of pure technological performance and data integrity. But even here, we must be critical. Oftentimes, the benchmarks are too narrow and can be gamed, and the model's performance on the test doesn't always translate into the real world. Then we have the human interaction layer, and this layer centers really on the person and how the person interacts with the tool. It examines how people actually use the technology, which often deviates from the intended design. For example, does a refugee recounting a traumatic experience, working with a caseworker or a therapist, trust this translation app knows where their data is going enough to speak freely? Or are they being very sensitive to the words that they're saying because they're worried about surveillance or where this data is going to go? And then does the asylum officer or the caseworker or the therapist who's pressed for time and is overworked, is over-relying on the app's flawed translation and is missing crucial nonverbal cues? This layer requires us to study technology in the wild, in real-world settings like an IRC office, so we can truly see how this functions at its point of use. It forces us not just to ask, does it work, but who does it work for? And what are the unintended consequences on those who interact with it? And then the third layer is the systemic impact layer. This is the widest lens, assessing technology's effect on broader systems like society, the economy, and the environment. For example, if a translation app is developed across an entire resettlement system, but it consistently misunderstands the dialect of a particular ethnic group, does this create systemic bias that disadvantages that whole group as a community? If a biometric aid system becomes the sole gateway to aid, Does this erode trust for those that fear these digital tools, or those that don't have access to this technology? Harms at this layer can have small individual effects that become deeply damaging when aggregated at a system level. So it's kind of like that butterfly effect. This sociotechnical perspective is vital because it moves us away from a simplistic, neutral view of technology. It forces us to see that a fair algorithm can still produce unjust outcomes if deployed in an unfair system. A safe technology can be dangerous in the hands of untrained or overwhelmed individuals. Also, technology is not culturally neutral. It's shaped by the values of the creator and must be evaluated and adapted within those specific socio-technical contexts. It recognizes that AI systems are not just tools, but are themselves socio-technical systems where humans and machines are intertwined and co-determines and that's where the risk ultimately manifests. And I found this to be a really interesting perspective, and actually some of the leaders on this perspective work at Google DeepMind. So it's not something that academics have developed. And there's also, I think, ways to look at these principles in how we develop technology itself. So we need to consider the broader systemic implications from day one. We need to make sure that there's feedback loops across those different layers. And then, of course, we need to prioritize transparency and explainability. I think the second critical lens that we should apply when we're looking at technology is one that helps us center the communities that we work in. So there was a fantastic report, and I'll work with Christy to send all these different resources, by CARE International, where they interviewed a lot of civil society leaders across the global south about AI. What does it mean to them? What are their reflections? What are the gaps that they see? And a lot of the participants shared a profound asymmetry. There's a lot of solutions that are designed in Silicon Valley. They're parachuted into communities in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, and the Middle East, with little regard for values, the infrastructure, or their lived realities. So this is data extractionism. So data is extracted from the communities in the global south, processed here, and then used to build solutions that are sold back to those communities. There are oftentimes places where those communities themselves are processing the data that we talked about as well, with questionable resourcing. And I think this is also fueled, there's good intentions in this as well. So there's the north-south Technosolutionism. This is an optimistic faith that technology, combined with market forces, can solve our problems, including problems in the rest of the world. So we can build a product in Palo Alto that helps us solve disease in sub-Saharan Africa. As one participant in the CARE study put it, there's a manipulation of vulnerability where communities are signed up to things that they don't know about or are not fully informed about. And I think this is especially dangerous when aid is conditional on providing this data. And I think this fails to ignore the deep contextual knowledge that local communities possess. We know that communities themselves, they're not just beneficiaries, they're expert in community outreach, participatory methods, and they know more about the complex social dynamics that any successful intervention must navigate. And I thought this was a really fantastic quote from the study. So there's a participant from Yemen who noted that AI tools often fail to give the right information because they lack local context. It doesn't provide the full picture because it gets metadata from the internet. But not all information is on the internet, especially not in our local languages and dialects. Ignoring these voices lead to profound misalignment. We see AI-powered chatbots for mental health being deployed in refugee camps, where the community's most pressing need is access to clean water. We might see digital literacy programs that are culturally irrelevant because they don't use local languages or are teaching techniques that are not grounded in local culture. To build responsible technology, we must shift from the model of extraction to one of genuine partnership, where we recognize that the most valuable expertise often lies beyond the walls of our offices. We must listen when a local civil society organization tells us they want to play an active role, not just in mitigating harms, but in shaping the potential benefits of technology for their communities. So part 3, how do we build responsible and inclusive futures? So here, I wanted to mention, there's a lot of different frameworks and guidelines around AI that are out there. And I think for the most part, they're all telling us the same thing. I wanted to mention the most comprehensive consensus on the ethics of AI, which is the UNESCO guidelines on responsible AI. This is a practical roadmap designed to translate values into policy and action. It's a long enough document, but it starts with 4 foundational core values. So the first is respect for human rights and the promotion of human dignity. The second is to ensure environmental and ecosystem flourishing. So how are we designing AI tools that respect the environment? To promote belonging and welcoming, including inclusiveness, right? How do we bring in the diversity of perspectives into development of AI? And then lastly, how do we make sure that we're building tools that help promote peaceful, just, and interconnected societies, not tools that help divide us? From these values, there are 10 core principles. These include the do no harm. 1 includes proportionality and fairness, privacy and data protection, transparency and explainability, and I think critically human oversight and determination. One thing, for example, that's very, very important and unequivocal is that life and death decisions should never be ceded to AI systems, and that the ultimate decision makers must always be with human actors. I think adopting these different frameworks don't stifle innovation. It helps us anchor innovation in shared values and ensures that technological progress serves all of humanity. So I think this is really part of the same conversation that we talked about when we talk about co-creation and that co-creation cycle. So I think important nod to the circle of the co-creation journey that was mentioned yesterday. So if the UNESCO guidelines tell us what to build, then the principles of inclusive designs tells us how to build it. So of course we must begin designing with communities. This means that we're embracing participatory approaches at every stage from the technology and AI lifecycle. I think somebody yesterday mentioned the AI lifecycle, and there was a really nice list of stages. So I think really important to go back to that. And I think this is not about tokenistic consultation. You build the tool, you bring in some users, you spend an hour with them, they give you feedback, oftentimes put it in a file, and then you continue the tool as it was. But that refugees and communities are active co-designers and experts in their own experience. Of course, this means that you need to invest in these communities first. You can't assume that your own digital literacy or digital capacity equals that of communities that haven't worked with this. And so this is where you talk about localization, where you're actually spending money on these communities as well. So you're not allocating your budget fully to HQ, and then you allocate a community participant also out of your HQ budget to work with communities. You find ways to actually share that budget with communities so they can actually hire their own people to participate and help design these different tools. And this fundamentally leverages the knowledge of these communities. I think when communities lead on identifying their own problems and co-design their own solutions, the outcomes are not just equitable, but more effective. We create legitimate spaces for dialogues where refugees, CBOs, technologists, and policymakers can work together as peers, finding common ground without reinforcing existing power imbalances. So how do you actually approach these spaces with equality? And I think this is the essence of participatory AI, which is an emerging field aimed at building systems that enhance community agency and self-determination. And I think also a really important principle is the right to opt out. So every refugee needs to feel like they have the right to say, no, I don't want my biometrics to be scanned. I don't want to have this conversation recorded. And essential services can't be made conditional on engaging with technology people don't trust or have the capacity to understand. I think it's really important to provide accessible non-digital alternatives. And I think this is relevant when we talk about virtual service delivery. And there are often times, for example, during COVID, where you don't have an alternative. But I think there needs to be an effort to build those non-digital alternatives. Because when you force vulnerable individuals onto digital platforms that they can't effectively use, that's another form of exclusion. These are some of UNHCR's core principles when it comes to building technology and specifically AI. So we're making sure that technology is human-centered, that it's built with integrity, that it's built in partnership with communities, but also the private sector, that there's proper governance in place, and that what we're doing is built with the utmost responsibility. So we're taking ownership of our actions as well as the potential outcomes that we're pursuing. And you see these principles all over the place. There's different formulations of these, but essentially they follow from this flow. I think what's really important when you design any of these principles or articulate them is actually resourcing them, like actually having, staffing behind the assessment of how we're benchmarking our performance with these principles, right? So I think it's easy to put stuff on a slide, but it's how we're actually embodying this in practice. I think that's really important. There's also human rights impact assessments. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of these initiatives being cut at a lot of the big tech companies, but oftentimes you have teams within big tech companies that do human rights impacts assessments. So this is like a formal process. Sometimes they contract it out, where you're looking at the human rights implications of the development of a new technology. And I think especially when we're talking about technology in humanitarian settings, these are non-negotiable. And again, I think these human rights impact assessments should go beyond the technical audits, but also examine potential impacts on privacy, non-discrimination, human dignity, especially for refugee communities. And as we mentioned above, making sure that this technology doesn't exacerbate existing inequalities. So we began in a kitchen with a trivial case of a problem orphaned by clever AI. And I think we end here in this room with a far more consequential choice. Will we allow our humanitarian mission and our social impact work to be distracted by the seductive promise of Technosolutionism? Can we afford to continue to orphan the deep systemic problems of displacement in favor of technical fixes? Will we cede the future of refugees to the dispassionate logic of AI and technologies? Or can we use and choose another path? A path guided by a deep respect for human dignity, a path paved with genuine partnerships and shared power with the communities that we serve, a path where technology serves humanity and not the other way around. And I also wanted to stress that going beyond the code doesn't mean abandoning technology. It means infusing it with our own values. It means having the courage to demand transparency from the tools that we work, to read the terms and conditions when you have the time, the wisdom to prioritize humanity over the hype. And I think this is really important. It's the commitment to not just build smarter or wiser systems, but really to build a more just and compassionate world. I think that's the challenge that we have ahead of us, and I think with this group here, we can build it together. Thank you. You can have to do it as well.
We have some time for a Q&A. Just got the mic, so any questions?
Thank you so much for your time. I learned a lot. I'm curious if you know of or have heard of any emerging models or organizations that are building within kind of like the mindset and framework that you spoke of for maybe incorporating into existing projects or technologies.
Yeah. That's a great question. I think you have an open source AI movement that Mozilla is really not to endorse any product, but I think Mozilla is working really hard on open source AI and looking at open source models where you have developers that can build their own tools without having to directly work with the foundation models. I think there's also Llama itself is an open source model as well. So there's different tools that have different teams that have the technical capacity can build their own local solutions as well. I think what you find is that it's just easier to use things outside the box. These tools outside the box are integrated into our work, right? Copilot now is an extension of Office, it feels, so it's integrated into your computer as well, and so it's hard not to use some of these more commercial products, but there's a lot of different folks that are looking at open source AI. I think you also see a lot of great digital rights organizations working on this space as well. Access Now, they're the ones that put the RightsCon conference together. They talk about this stuff, a lot more technical depth as well. So there's different places to look if you know where to look.
Thanks, Hisham. I have a million notes I jotted down. I think this conversation is really helpful for us in the room to be critical of AI. I'm not sure it's happening in Silicon Valley. So what can we do to kind of bridge that gap where we have concerns around, thinking about the humanitarian space and how this tool could be used and putting that in front of the folks at these companies that will remain unmentioned?
Yeah.
Can I tack on to that one?
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, no, thanks. I actually had the same thought as well. With the premise of perfect cannot be enemy of the good, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we need to keep moving. I also am missing, to be honest, just a little bit of the other flip of the coin, the other side of the coin, which is technological, or what is it, effective acceleration, whatever. There's the other flip of the coin, where the idea is that let the AI do what the AI does, let it evolve, without necessarily fiddling too much into it. So I'm just wondering, how to have those discussions with from all chambers?
Yeah. So first we talked about like the strong market forces that exist that are propelling like the development of strong AI, big AI. You're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, right? There's competition geopolitically. There's also, I think, just like a core belief that this is the technology that's going to solve all of our problems once we get to AGI. So I think you have a lot of folks on the side of the table, both like from a normative perspective, but also like economic perspective, that want to build. There are some strong communities, including with member states, that exist in Silicon Valley that create what they call like techno diplomacy. So the Swiss government has a ambassador that specifically focuses on pushing back and advocating with the big tech companies on content moderation, on safety, on regulation. The EU has some folks there, the Danes themselves. I think you often find, they're engaging with the right policy teams. So I think there's a good initiative around this work. I would also, a lot of the discussion is focused on the use of AI in military settings and the risk that creates to civilians trapped in armed conflict. And that's when we talk about kind of that error of dispassion, like that's where this comes to a head, right? If you can sit somewhere and just follow recommendations on what they call like shortening the kill chain, then that creates big problems for like our ability to have moral reasoning in military domains. And so a lot of teams work on that. You actually have the UN Office of Human Rights has a full-time person that's in the South Bay, and they do these conversations. And then there's also somebody from the International Committee of the Red Cross, specifically a technology advocate that works on this. One really great tool that I recommend everyone to look at is called Digital Dilemmas. So you can just Google that. And it's like a gamified project by the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is really designed for policymakers, government officials, as well as technology professionals to really bring ahead some of the decisions that refugees might face when it comes to engaging with technology. So there's a lot of different folks working on it. You also have like the universities themselves. There's of course, the AI Ethics Lab, right, Rutgers, but there's the Human Rights Center at Berkeley that's also working on this, and Stanford has a Center for, I think, Inclusive AI, something like that. So there's a lot of work around it. How do you kind of create like a sharper approach and bring this all together? This is like the classic story of how do you organize. But also you have the market forces are much larger.
My question is, I know you mentioned a lot of ideas that's around, that's working to make sure there's the integrity and humanitarian work is be done with feelings. I always say like behind a computer there's a human being, but probably wrong by now after speaking to you, after hearing you. Behind every human there's a computer, another computer or machine that's taking data. So my question is there any efforts that's been done in countries that are mostly affected or that have high intensive refugees that are impacted? Because I can see Silicon Valley and everything you mentioned. Is there any effort that's been done direct in those countries to feeding, I don't think it's the right word, but at least to have an idea of how we can best serve the most vulnerable?
Absolutely. And I'm looking for the example that I had here that I didn't mention. There's a lot of like stuff that's happening in sub-Saharan Africa. For example, I think University of Uganda, they have their own AI lab and they're building their own models to look at kind of under-resourced languages in Uganda and creating LLMs there. You have work in the Middle East on Arabic dialects and how do you create better AI there. You also have different countries. You could say how successful this is, but the UAE is working on building their own AI models. They're investing heavily in data centers and whatnot. once I find the actual example, I'll share it with you. But there's a lot of fantastic stuff, and I think really like one of the themes here is that this idea of like bigger is better is sometimes a distraction. You can do some incredible work on AI without having to have like hundreds of billions of dollars. And a lot of universities in the global south are doing that as well. I think it's just, a lot of the conversation is overshadowed by some of the stuff we're talking about here. But it's a great question. Let's see, where is it?
So my question is kind of related to your last comment. And so like one of the themes that I've heard over and over again in these 2 days has been about co-creation and local participation. And the question that always comes up for me is like what's local? Like how do you balance like the efficiencies that we're looking for in technology, the big, with the hyper local? Like what's the sweet spot? So like, we've heard from national perspectives, international perspectives, state perspectives. And I'm just like really curious if you have any thoughts about like how local is local enough?
Yeah.
And like what is local participation? Like at what level is it the most meaningful?
Yeah.
Looking for, to reach the goals that you have.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious for your thoughts.
I think the paradox here is when you're designing technology, you want to design it for scale. But when you're designing for scale, that's in tension with creating things that are local. So in the private sector, the way that they assess this is by, like, they do analytics, right? It's like, we'll design a technology and we will evaluate its effectiveness by the amount of users that are using it. And that's a kind of proxy for its impact. I think for us, because we're driven not by how many users use it and how much money we are able to generate, but on the impact of them, on the impact of this technology on the core problem that we're solving for. In my opinion, I don't think you can go too local. Like there's like as targeted as you can be. I think you're creating more of that impact at a community level, at a household level. So that's just I know that's like if we had infinite resources, that's how I would do it. It's like we can get as localized as we can. I think the challenge is that you want to design something that works at scale, and so that's when you have to have really robust kind of that socio-technical evaluation approach, so that you're building what you're building, but then you're able to assess it with the right granularity to make sure that you're solving the right problems. And I think again, sometimes the problems that you are there to solve are not to be solved by technology too. So I think that's like part of this approach. Perhaps it's a policy issue as well. So I think that's the lens that I wanted to make sure that we get across.
I have
Can I
a.
ask you, sorry, Hisham, I
Yeah.
do need to press on that comment.
Yeah.
So who decides that? Like, it's not that we've done a great job as humans
Yeah.
solving all of these problems. So who decides that problems are not to be solved by technology but
Yeah.
by humans? And why? Again, it's not like
Yeah.
we have a great track record.
Absolutely, and I think it's us as community members that need to decide that. Like, is it, for example, New York City? Do we need to have a better app to help us understand, where there's affordable housing, and how do we better get folks to apply to affordable housing in a more efficient way? Or is it just simply there's not enough affordable housing built for policy reasons in our communities, right? So I think that's at least the approach that I'm arguing for here.
So you don't think that AI would arrive to that conclusion itself, that we have to influence it in order to tell it, well, hey, no, the problem is really this, so you should be looking elsewhere. You
Yeah.
don't think that AI has the capacity to actually conclude that on its own?
I think the AI can help us, just like any research, you can have, 10 social scientists and researchers like Graham analyzing what are the problems with affordable housing in New York City, and they'll give you a set of recommendation. But it's really ultimately, an AI can do that in like 30 seconds now, right? I think that's a problem in and of itself. But ultimately, it's the political will to solve these problems that's the problem. The AI itself is not going to solve these problems for us. I think that's just the perspective. I think AI solves a lot of great problems and helps like do our work better, more efficiently, helps us create lovely presentations. Like, for example, I'm a huge fan. Like I think, and the irony here is that I'm a kind of techno optimist myself. I love technology. I use it every day. I'm like, buy the latest gadgets. But I think I've just been in Silicon Valley for long enough to see how there's just this disconnect between what are real problems in the world and what the narrative is in these huge, powerful, and very wealthy companies as well. But like, very good questions, and I think this is the debate that we should be talking about. Yeah.
At the state admin level, a push for systemization and efficiency-driven focus often clouds our empathetic lens. How do we reclaim balance between efficiency-driven tech approaches and our core strength, which is empathy?
I think you need to just make sure that the narratives around like technological development and efficiency aren't used to like lower your caseworker FTE, for example, right? Or thinking like, I don't need to hire an Afghan caseworker because I now have an AI tool that helps translate Pashto and Farsi pretty well, and it's pretty seamless. And so you're looking at that interaction with the refugee simply in the lens of, we need to make sure that it's linguistically sensitive, without thinking about like there's a reason why having an Afghan caseworker that's been resettled themselves, that understand their community, that understand things that perhaps are not in our cultural orientation by design, like this is where the great Friday sermon imam is, like you gotta go to this mosque, like this is where it's at, where a caseworker is not gonna know that. And I think that's the key, is that the efficiency is solving for a specific problem, like the technology is, but there's certain things that the technology can't replace. And I think that's the risk, is when you're using like the implementation of technology, and we feel this because budgets are shrinking all over the place, as some sort of magic bullet so that you can justify lowering your caseworker or hiring, we don't need to hire a teacher, we don't need to hire an ESL teacher now because we can just share a link to an AI-driven language class, and we're golden. So I think that's I don't think there's like a easy answer for this, but that's my perspective.
So that's actually the point I want to dig into a little bit deeper. And I'm not promising that you're going to have the answers, but I'm the CEO of Peace Geeks, which is an international tech nonprofit that has actually built digital tools for UNHCR. And again, this was not, I'm sure, your office or your purview, but the maintenance cost for that tech was $6,000 a year. And so when we're looking at these systems, and I agree with everything that you've presented, I think that one of the things that we need to speak about, especially now that budgets are shrinking for refugee support, is how do we figure out how to build more adaptive technology that uses the efficiencies where we can, but keeps the human in the loop, in the mix, with an off-ramp so that people can talk to a human being because it's the best solution. It creates effective outcomes, but also because, the budgets to do the technology the right way are also not necessarily there. Like, I'd love to design every system with all of those components. Yeah. So anyways, any thoughts that you have on that? And of course, to any funders in the room, just that this involves investment that I know is very hard to do.
Absolutely. I think one of the draws of having better AI and agentic AI is that it's getting cheaper to develop technology. It is, like, I don't know if anyone's used like Replit or some of these like agentic. It's really mind-blowing. Like, you can put in a prompt and it'll spit out literally an app for you. And you know, perhaps not the best app, but with a few tweaks, you're able to ship something out pretty simply. Replit's a good example. Not that I endorse any product, but that's Lovable's fantastic as well. Like, and it can design it with really nice graphics, all that stuff. I think the key thing, and this is what I've been try to say, is that like the main costs isn't the technology itself. It's how it's implemented, it's how it's integrated into a community. It's the change management that needs to go into making sure that your staff know how to use this, are integrating this into the workflow. So absolutely more money every day to do this work.
We have time for a few more questions.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
No, yeah.
I wanted to ask, actually, and I got invited yesterday to this. It's AI for Good Summit, and anyone wants to go to this event, I'm more than happy to extend the invite. It is at Stanford. My question is more of the conversation that you've had about refugees and, oh, well, how do we serve this population? I think there needs to be representation so people can be supported and we can have a say. It is great that we're looking for refugees and we're trying to protect refugees, but I remember when I was a refugee, I wanted programs to where I can make money and I can live comfortably or live in a dignified way. How do we have this conversation better with these people, better either techs or either execs? That's the first question. The second question is, what do we have to do and who do we connect with to get people like you to speak with these people so we can increase representation for our people directly? And I mean this sincerely. And how do we increase basically that partnership?
First, I wanted to, there's like the critical work that, for example, Upwardly Global is doing in helping create more of these channels. I know that Upwardly Global, yes, is doing in terms of helping create like pathways for refugees to get better paying, higher skilled jobs that are integrating, where you're able to build the digital literacy and capacity to do this work. I know that, forget if it's still under CEO, but we used to have like career development programs at IRC all the time. I think when you build, so this is the idea of like that starfish story where you throw it back. Like, it's like working with every individual so that they become more digitally literate. They can become participants. Like, these are refugee individuals, participants in the economy, and then they can become advocates because they can then become part of these tech firms or part of the global workforce. I think it's a little bit of the kind of, this is the typical like market-driven approach to how we do refugee resettlement in this country, is that we really want to make sure that refugees are engaged in the market, that they can get jobs, you know, very quickly, and then they can grow. And I think the impact of this is once a refugee has this higher paid job, is working at a company in Silicon Valley, they can then become advocates for the community itself. I think that there's a lot of these platforms on solutions for refugees, like Tent does really great work. I see David Miliband is always kind of doing work around technology and inclusion, and there's, you know, the Airbell team as well. So I think we're doing good work on this front, and this kind of goes back to the question on Nicole, what is going to be impactful to advocate for better policies? It's going to be like our collective effort, recognizing that there's market forces that are pushing back the other direction. AI for Good Summit there's like a big AI for Good Summit that happens in Geneva by ITU as well. Technosolutionism, I think again, this is just a framework. There's a lot of important work that needs to happen around technology itself. You find a lot of these big summits. Are also sponsored by a lot of our technology partners as well. And so that's where you have to be a little bit kind of careful in terms of, is this a summit to talk about a financial interest in selling a specific solution, or is it really solving a problem that we really care about? So I think that's one of the things to think through. There's a lot of these AI for good summits. Can't keep track anymore.
With some of the pitfalls that you're highlighting, like the flattening that you talked about, do you expect the emergence of AGI to only exacerbate that problem, or do you expect that some of those gaps might be filled?
I don't think there's going to be a real emergence of AGI.
Okay. I guess maybe as AI progresses, maybe.
Yeah. I think it'll just become easier at masking like the human complexity, right? It does it really well, and you have these stories of like people falling in love with their AI, and some horrible stories of like, I think we talked about the AI is inferring based on the data that they have from like the corpus, like the internet, but also your interaction, what you want to hear. Right, so you're going to always feel like the AI is speaking to you because that's what it's designed to do. That doesn't mean that it's a good thing. Like if you're somebody that's depressive by nature, the AI, yeah, look in the mirror. The AI might like feed on that and take you to a place where you don't want to be. And so you see these stories of like the AI encouraging suicidal ideation, things like that. So I think it'll get better at masking these things, but it won't replace the kind of messy human interactions. I think you hear this AGI stuff. You have folks say that we've already reached AGI, and then you have big tech companies that say like, just give us another $100 billion and we're going to get to AGI. Just like give us a few more years. Artificial general intelligence, yes. So the idea that you're going to build like a, Skynet like AI that can just control everything and do everything and solve all our problems. Something that's just like, AI is currently like, it solves a specific problem. If you get a general AI, it can solve all of our problems with like human accuracy and intelligence. Is that right? Would you say, like, in a nutshell? Nate's working on AGI, so I can ask him.
Thank you, Hisham. I really, is this working? I really enjoyed your presentation. I think it was excellent, and I think you really showed why UNHCR's leadership in this space is critical going forward. I also really look forward to seeing your presentation in some kind of published form, hopefully very soon, because I think it's going to be a useful article to draw on. I particularly appreciated your focus on the problem and the problem of figuring out what the problem is in many ways, and the kind of multifaceted nature of the problem. And it kind of reminded me of the research work that we're doing at Switchboard, where we're talking to caseworkers and direct service providers and asking them what the kinds of everyday challenges that they're facing in order to understand the problems of their clients. And certain things come up repeatedly. The problem of time, just simply not having enough time to spend with a person to figure out what their problems are that can be solved, whether by AI or any other kind of means. And then the problem is a problem of kind of listening. That they really don't get the opportunity to listen to clients. So there's a lot of kind of one-way information that flows to the client, but very, very little space to really listen. And these are very basic problems, but it's really hard to imagine that other problems are solved if we don't get through these kinds of things. So I think your presentation sort of very eloquently outlined the arguments for focusing on the problem before jumping to some kind of solution. But my question is, another kind of problem relates to data and the sensitivity of data. And one of the solutions that we're seeing presented more is synthetic data. So to basically, for data sets, generate a fictionalized copy of, or version of a real data set that's totally fictionalized, synthetic, and that can be used to analyze and kind of drive these data-driven solutions. And I've seen that one of the big survey companies is now marketing synthetic focus group data. So this is focus group data that isn't generated by real people talking about real problems. Yeah. But I don't know how they're doing it, but they're certainly, they've started marketing it. So I think I'd be interested in hearing your views on synthetic data and what potential that may offer, and also what kinds of pitfalls that may bring to the table.
Great question, Graham. Thanks for asking. First, on the problem identification, one of the challenges with better data and more data is that you reveal more problems. That doesn't mean that you have more resources to solve these problems, and I think that's one of the scary parts. You can have the best AI, and for example, this is like some dystopian perhaps view, but you equip every caseworker intake meeting with I don't know if this is happening already, so I apologize, but you equip every caseworker, IRC caseworker office with a transcription, AI-driven transcription recording. And it records every single conversation that you're having with refugee clients. You will identify more problems than you currently know about, and you'll have data about problems. You might see that there's more domestic violence that's happening in this community. Maybe you had a hunch about it, you heard about it anecdotally, but if you have this data, now it's going to be like objectively revealed. That doesn't mean that suddenly you have more resources to address domestic violence. So I think you always have that tension. Like more data, it's going to help you identify more problems. Maybe that means you can advocate for more funding because it's data driven and donors like that. But I think there's always that tension. I think with the synthetic data stuff, it goes back to how is the synthetic like persona. I imagine like what they do is like they create like AI personas for, I don't know, like, middle-aged man with 3 kids from the Middle East, right? And then they feed it data based on like what the typical person of this background thinks and shares and likes, and then they model like decisions based on that. You can probably do that like yourself, like go to ChatGPT, you can prompt it, give me a persona of this person, and then you start asking it, what would this person think about this or that, or what type of soda would they like? I'm sure it'll give you an answer. I think it just goes back to like, what is the synthetic data that's being trained upon? And oftentimes it's built upon the data that exists in the world. And this goes back to one of the biases that might be existing in some of the models that we use every day. So these models, usually they're just scraping like hundreds of billions of pieces of text off the internet. And so, for example, around refugee sentiments and host government, host society sentiments on refugees, if the data that it's being absorbed heavily is biased against refugees, right? So if you're associating the word refugee with risk, with economic burden, with not part of our culture, because that's what a lot of the information on the internet has. And so what happens with an LLM, and you know this, is that when you write the word refugee, the weights of what they want to infer coming after the word refugee is heavily biased by the training data that it has. So it's going to be producing things that are going to be negative to refugees as well. And I think it goes back to like, how are they creating these synthetic data models as well? But thanks for asking the easy questions, Sigra.